In the 1830s, the United States government did something truly unthinkable. It forcibly removed tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast. This was a brutal state-sanctioned displacement, and it's left an indelible scar on American history. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the story of what became known as the Trail of Tears. You know, the name itself, it comes directly from the horror of the experience. This wasn't a name that historians came up with decades later. No, it was born from the suffering itself. During the very first forced removal in 1831, a Choctaw chief, watching the death and misery of his people on their journey west, described it with this haunting phrase. It perfectly captured the agony, and that name stuck. So who are the people at the very heart of this tragedy? Well, we're talking about 5 distinct autonomous nations: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Muscogee, who you might know as the Creek, and the Seminole. For generations upon generations, they had called the American Southeast their home. Now, this term you see here, 5 civilized tribes, is really key to understanding the story. It was a name used by white settlers because these nations were actively adopting many aspects of American society. The Cherokee, for example, created their own written language, they drafted a constitution modeled after the U.S., and even established a capital city. They were building these prosperous farming communities, truly believing this was the path to coexist with their American neighbors. But that coexistence, well, it was not meant to be. A relentless wave of pressure was building from American settlers. And they didn't see neighbors. They saw obstacles. They coveted that fertile land, especially for expanding the huge cotton plantations of the South, an industry, of course, fueled by the labor of enslaved people. And you can see right here just how quickly everything escalated. For years, you had these land-hungry settlers pushing onto native lands. But then, in 1828, the game completely changed. Gold was discovered in Georgia, right on Cherokee land. The pressure cooker just exploded into an absolute frenzy. And all of that culminated just 2 years later, when President Andrew Jackson, a man who had built his entire political career as an Indian fighter, signed the Indian Removal Act. Okay, so this is a really crucial point about this act. What it did, and maybe more importantly, what it did not authorize. It gave the president the power to negotiate treaties for a land exchange, but it did not legally permit the government to just force these nations off their land without a treaty. On paper, at least, this was all supposed to be a voluntary exchange. And right here, in his own words to Congress, we can see the official justification. President Jackson actually framed removal as this benevolent, protective policy. He argued it would save Native Americans from state oppression and allow them to flourish. The gap between these stated goals and the brutal reality that followed is it's staggering. So, facing this immense pressure, the Native nations didn't just give in, not at all. They fought back, using the American legal system itself. And the Cherokee Nation, in particular, took their case all the way to the highest court in the land. This was a landmark moment, a real turning point. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, actually sided with the Cherokee. They affirmed their sovereignty and ruled that Georgia had zero right to impose its laws on them. It was a huge legal victory. But what good is a legal victory if the executive branch just refuses to enforce it? President Jackson simply ignored the Supreme Court, completely defying a co-equal branch of government and, in doing so, sealing the Cherokee's fate. With the rule of law just tossed aside, the U.S. government found another way. They found a small, dissenting group of about 100 Cherokee leaders, a group that became known as the Treaty Party, and they negotiated a removal treaty with them. This so-called Treaty of New Eshota was signed without any authority from the actual Cherokee National Council and against the will of their elected leader, John Ross, and the vast majority of the Cherokee people. It was totally fraudulent, but for the U.S. government, it was all the legal justification they needed. And so, the removals began. The Choctaw were the first to go in 1831, and their tragic journey became a grim blueprint for what was to come. The other nations followed, one by one, culminating in the forced removal of the Cherokee in 1838 under Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren. Just let that number sink in. 60,000. Between 1830 and 1850, a total of 60,000 men, women, and children from these 5 nations were driven out of the only homes they had ever known. And this opened up 25 million acres of their land for white settlement and, of course, for slavery. The roundup itself was absolutely brutal. 7,000 soldiers descended on the Cherokee Nation, literally dragging people from their homes with no time to gather their belongings. Families were torn apart, their farms and everything they owned just left behind to be looted by settlers. This quote here from an American soldier who actually participated, it shows that even some of the men carrying out the orders were horrified by what they were being forced to do. And before that 1,000-mile march even started, thousands of people were herded into these squalid internment camps. Imagine, crowded together with barely any food, clean water, or sanitation. These camps became breeding grounds for deadly diseases like cholera and dysentery. For so many, the Trail of Tears ended before it even really began. And these numbers, just take a moment to absorb them. For the Cherokee, as many as 8,000 people died. That could be as much as half of their population that was removed, according to some estimates. For the Choctaw, who walked the trail first, thousands perished. Across all 5 nations, the total death toll is estimated to be well over 10,000 people, and possibly as high as 15,000 or even more. This wasn't just a relocation. It was an absolute catastrophe. So, what is the legacy of an event like this? I mean, how do we even begin to understand and classify an atrocity on this scale? It's a really tough question, and it's a debate that continues among historians and scholars to this very day. So, this brings us to a really serious debate among historians. On one hand, many classify it as ethnic cleansing. The stated goal of the Indian Removal Act, after all, was removal, not necessarily physical extermination. But on the other hand, many scholars argue that it was, in fact, genocide. They point out that even if the stated goal wasn't extermination, the conditions of the removal, the death marches, the disease-ridden camps, the starvation, were so brutal that they were pretty much calculated to bring about the destruction of a significant part of the group. You know, any kind of official acknowledgement of this history has been incredibly slow. It wasn't until 1987, nearly 150 years after the Cherokee removal, that the U.S. government officially designated the Trail of Tears as a National Historic Trail. It's a formal act of preservation, and it ensures that the paths of this forced migration, which stretch over 2,200 miles across 9 states, are not erased from the map or from our memory. And that really leaves us with a fundamental question. Memorializing a historic trail is one step, for sure, but confronting the full, unvarnished truth of an event like the Trail of Tears is something else entirely. It really forces us to ask, how should a nation remember, teach, and truly learn from its darkest chapters to make sure they are never, ever repeated?